Ragnar Lothbrok's death in the Pit of Snakes was dramatic, but it wasn't consistent with who he'd become. And if you trace the pattern of his choices backward to the arc of his transformation, what emerges is not a warrior seeking glory in death, but an explorer who spent his entire life trying to escape the very legend he created, which means the ending that would have honored his established psychology wasn't martyrdom in England, but disappearance into the unknown, vanishing from the story. Entirely the same way he always vanished from responsibility when the weight of other people's expectations became unbearable. Spoilers ahead. The mistake most interpretations make is treating Ragnar as a conqueror, as a man driven by power and expansion, and the desire to build an empire, but that framework collapses the moment you examine what actually motivated his decisions across the first 4 seasons. Because Ragnar's primary engine was never conquest. It was curiosity, the need to see what existed beyond the edge of the known world. And every major choice he made that seemed like ambition was actually an attempt to move toward questions rather than answers, toward uncertainty rather than control, which is why he became obsessed with raiding west when everyone else was content raiding east, why he risked everything to reach England when the safer choice was consolidating power at home, why he kept pushing toward Paris even after the first brutal failure. Not because he wanted to rule those places, but because the act of reaching them represented something his life in Kattegat could never provide, a sense of forward motion that wasn't tied to managing other people's needs and expectations, and endless political maneuvering that bored him to the point of visible despair. The first major decision that reveals this pattern is a choice to leave for England immediately after becoming Earl, the moment when most leaders would have focused on securing power and building alliances and ensuring the stability of their new position. But Ragnar left, he handed responsibility to his wife and took his crew west again. And the show frames this as strategic ambition, as a leader expanding his influence. But the psychological truth underneath is simpler and darker. He was running from a role he'd just won, escaping the administrative weight of leadership by chasing the next horizon. And this pattern repeats with escalating intensity every time the responsibilities of his position grow larger, every time his fame spreads wider. Every time the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok becomes more inescapable, he finds a reason to leave, to raid, to explore, to put himself in situations where the rules are unclear and the outcome is uncertain. Because that uncertainty is the only state where he feels like himself rather than the character everyone expects him to perform. The Paris obsession is where this becomes undeniable, where the gap between what Ragnar claims to want and what his behavior reveals becomes too wide to ignore, because after first failed siege, he had every rational reason to abandon the campaign. The losses were catastrophic. The political cost at home was mounting. His reputation was damaged, and yet he went back, not once but twice, pouring resources and lives into a target that offered diminishing strategic returns. And the show presents this as stubbornness, as a king refusing to accept defeat. But stubbornness doesn't explain why he seemed more alive during the planning and the voyage and the chaos of battle than he ever did sitting in the Great Hall, making judicial decisions and managing trade disputes and playing the role of wise ruler. Because the Paris campaigns weren't about winning. They were about having a reason to leave Kattegat, to escape the suffocating predictability of being Ragnar Lothbrok, the king, and return to being Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who doesn't know what's on the other side of the wall. What makes this psychologically coherent is that Ragnar's fear wasn't death, it was ordinariness, the slow death of becoming exactly what everyone expected, a predictable figure performing predictable duties in a predictable cycle until the story stopped moving forward and became just maintenance. And you can see this fear surface explicitly in his interactions with his sons, particularly Bjorn, where he oscillates between desperate attempts to connect and equally desperate attempts to push them away. Because his sons represent both his legacy and his replacement, the next generation who will take over the story and reduce him to a name people invoke rather than a living person making choices. And the closer they get to surpassing him, the more restless he becomes, the more he starts talking about China, about going farther than anyone has ever gone, about finding something beyond the edge of the world that no one else will ever reach, which is an ambition in any traditional sense. It's a fantasy of escaping history itself, of moving so far forward that the past can't catch up and turn him into a static symbol rather than a moving target. The show gave us a version of Ragnar who became disillusioned and broken after the time jump, a man who lost his faith, his drive, and descended into drugs and apathy and self-destruction before finally rousing himself for one last raid that would end in his death. And narratively, this creates a tragic arc. The rise and fall of a great man, the hero destroyed by his own success. But psychologically, it inverts who Ragnar actually was, because the man we watched for 4 seasons didn't break. When things got hard, he broke when things got easy, when the challenges became predictable, when he'd already proven he could raid England and survive Paris, and when every political game and father-sons who would carry on his name, when there were no more unknowns left except the ultimate unknown of death. And at that point, the character we knew wouldn't have sunk into apathy and then forced himself to rise for one dramatic finale. He would have simply left, walked away from Kattegat and kingship and family and fame, and disappeared into the next question, the next edge, the next place where no one knew his name, and he could return to being a person instead of a legend. The death in the snake pit works as spectacle, as a scene designed to give Ragnar a memorable exit and set up his son's revenge arc and provide emotional catharsis for the audience. But it requires us to believe that the same man who spent his entire arc avoiding the cage of other people's expectations would willingly walk into a literal cage, would orchestrate his own martyrdom, would give King Ecbert and the Saxons and history itself exactly what they wanted, a dramatic ending that solidifies the legend and transforms him from a complicated human into a clean narrative symbol. And that's a fundamental contradiction, because everything Ragnar did before that final season was about refusing to be the thing people needed him to be, refusing to stay in Kattegat when they needed a king, refusing to be a faithful husband when Lager needed stability, refusing to be a present father when his sons needed guidance, refusing to perform a role even when the cost was isolation and resentment and the gradual erosion of every relationship he had. So the idea that he would suddenly cooperate with his own mythologization, that he would give the story the ending it wanted rather than the ending that served his psychology, doesn't fit the pattern of someone who spent 20 years running from exactly that kind of closure. The alternate path that remains consistent with Ragnar's established psychology begins at the same moment of disillusionment the show gave us, the realization that he'd become everything he didn't want to be, a king managing a kingdom, a father whose sons see him as competition rather than connection, a legend whose fame has calcified into expectations he can't escape. But instead of sinking into apathy and drugs and waiting for the story to give him an exit, this version of Ragnar does what he always did when the cage became unbearable. He leaves, not for another raid, not for another attempt to prove himself to people who already know his name, but for a journey with no strategic purpose, no political justification, no explanation that would make sense to anyone in Kattegat, because he's done trying to make his choices legible to people who measure everything by power and legacy and dynasty. The first step is simple and devastating. He takes a small boat, provisions for a long journey, no crew, no warriors, no witnesses, and he sails west, past England, past the settlements he founded, past the edge of every map the Norse have made. And he doesn't tell anyone where he's going because the point isn't the destination. The point is moving towards something undefined. And when his sons eventually search for him, they find nothing, no body, no shipwreck, no closure, just the absence of a man who chose to become a question mark rather than an answer. And this is psychologically consistent because Ragnar's deepest need was never to be remembered. It was to keep moving, to exist in the space between the known and the unknown, and the only way to preserve that state permanently was to remove himself from the story before it could fix him in place. The second step addresses what happens to the legend when the man disappears, because without a body, without a confirmed death, without a final scene to analyze and commemorate, Ragnar Lothbrok becomes something more unsettling than a martyr. He becomes a loose thread in the fabric of Norse history, a man who might still be out there, who might return, who can't be neatly categorized as dead or alive, victor or victim, success or failure. And this ambiguity is poison to the kind of clean legacy his sons want to inherit. Because how do you avenge a father who might not be dead? How do you surpass a father who might still be discovering new worlds while you're stuck managing the one he left behind? And the psychological cruelty of this choice is that it's the same cruelty Ragnar enacted on everyone who loved him throughout his life. The refusal to be present, to be graspable, to provide the clarity and closure that would allow them to move on. Except now it's permanent. Now it's his final statement about who he was and what he valued, not his son's futures, not his legacy, not even his own survival. Just the uninterrupted continuation of forward motion, of curiosity, of the search for what's beyond the next wave. The third step is understanding what this ending costs and why that cost makes it more honest than the martyrdom the show provided. Because if Ragnar dies in the snake pit, he gives his sons a clear enemy, a unified purpose, a narrative that transforms their complicated feelings about their absent father into something simple and actionable: revenge. And the great heathen army becomes possible. The invasion of England becomes inevitable. The story continues with momentum and clarity and emotional satisfaction. But if Ragnar simply disappears and his sons inherit confusion instead of mission, they're left with a father who chose the unknown over them one final time, who valued his own freedom more than their need for answers, and they can't. Avenge that they can't raid their way to closure. They have to sit with the reality that some people are too restless to be held even by love, even by blood, even by the promise of legacy. And that's a harder truth than noble sacrifice, a more uncomfortable truth. But it's a truth that fits the man who repeatedly chose a horizon over the heart for his entire adult life. This alternate ending doesn't give the audience catharsis, doesn't give the sons heroic motivation, doesn't give history a clean narrative to package and repeat, and that's exactly why it works psychologically. Because Ragnar's entire arc was about resisting the demands of narrative convenience, about making choices that prioritize his internal need for motion and discovery over the external needs of everyone who wanted him to be king, father, husband, leader, symbol, and the most consistent possible ending for a character defined by that resistance isn't dramatic cooperation with his own legend-making. It's quiet defection from the story itself, walking away from the stage while everyone is still watching, refusing to deliver the final speech or the memorable last words or the death scene that explains what all meant, just gone, unreachable, unknowable, exactly as he always wanted to be. The cost of this ending extends beyond his immediate family to the entire structure of what Vikings, as a show, wanted to say about legacy and destiny and the price of greatness. Because the show needed Ragnar to die meaningfully, so his death could mean something to the audience, could teach lessons about hubris or faith or the cyclical nature of violence, could set up the next generation's story with clear cause and effect. And a disappearance breaks that machinery, refuses to feed the narrative engine, leaves everyone, including the viewers, without the satisfaction of understanding what was all for. And in a culture that values story and saga and the immortality of being remembered, Ragnar choosing to become a gap in the record rather than a complete chapter is the ultimate rebellion, not against his enemies, but against the fundamental human need to make sense of lives through narrative structure. What this reveals about the character is that Ragnar's relationship with exploration was never about discovery in service of something larger. It was about discovery as an end in itself, the process mattering more than any product, the journey mattering more than any destination. And when you build a life around that principle, you eventually run out of new places to raid, and new kingdoms to challenge, and new frontiers that exist on a map, which means the only frontier left is the one beyond the map, beyond the story, beyond the reach of anyone who wants to freeze you in place by understanding you completely. And the man who spent his youth sailing west against all advice, who spent his middle years chasing Paris despite catastrophic failure, who spent his late years talking about China and the edge of the world, that man's final move wouldn't be surrender to narrative convention. It would be one more voyage into space where the story stops tracking him. If you change the choice, you change the person. And the choice to die in England transforms Ragnar into a tragic hero, a flawed king, a father whose death united his sons, a legend whose end gave meaning to his beginning. But the choice to vanish transforms him into something the story can't fully contain, an explorer who explored so far he explored out of the narrative itself, a question without an answer, a movement without a conclusion. And that's not dramatic. It's not satisfying. It doesn't give anyone what they want. But it's honest the psychology of a man who never gave anyone what they wanted when it conflicted with his need to keep moving toward the unknown, even if the ultimate unknown was what happens when you choose yourself over everyone who needs you to stay.